Hello, my name is Gemma Gunn, and this is my final presentation video for the Human Interface Design module. So at the very beginning of this project, we were given some broad prompts to help guide us in the right direction for coming up with our ideas for the project. These were gamification, art for art's sake, sociological and commercial. I ended up going with the art for art's sake and surrealism one because it was more interesting to me, the idea of making something purely for the sake of art and entertainment. So I initially began brainstorming ideas, and I quickly came up with the idea of a skeleton or sort of X-ray filter, which I then ended up sticking with for the length of this project. So I initially had a lot of big ideas for where I wanted this project to go. I wanted it to have different layers, like the skeleton layer, and then the muscle layer, reproductive system, digestive system. Initially, I just wanted to stick on making the skeleton, and then seeing if I had time, if I could make the other ones go from there. So pretty early on, we had our first presentation where we pitched our ideas to the class. You can see it here. I ended up getting a lot of helpful feedback about how realistic my idea was, what softwares I could use and what directions to go in. So I wrote this feedback down and I applied it as I went on with my project. I began by trying to find free skeleton assets online that were pre-rigged so they could connect to a body. In all honesty, I started this project a little backwards. I was doing this before I'd actually decided on what software I was going to be using. I played around with Aero for a bit before I came to the conclusion it wasn't working with my idea, so then I moved on to Snapchat Lens Studio. But researching the assets, it was a little bit difficult at first. Most of them were behind a huge paywall or were very complicated. But eventually I got lucky enough and I found one that was simple enough and was free for me to download. I then started practicing with Lens Studio just to get a bit more comfortable with the software. So the first picture you can see there is the sort of tutorial that Lens Studio gives you when you log in. It's a birthday filter. We had a lab in one of our classes as well where we were playing around with sort of a face morph filter. You can see that as well. And eventually I got more comfortable in Lens Studio, so I began trying to see how I could make my own skeleton filter. Originally, I tried to bring in my own skeleton asset, but it was too complicated, and obviously the actual rig in the skeleton asset that I had didn't match up with the human body rig that Snapchat Lens Studio has. So instead, I focused on bringing in bland blocks from Blender and making them move with the body parts so I could then remodel them and refine it as a realistic skeleton. But before I could do that, I had to learn how to use the 3D full body tracking rig that Lens Studio offers. So I read some of their website explanations and watched a few tutorials on how to make a full body tracking filter in Lens Studio. Around this time, we also had our mid-semester presentation where we had to showcase the research that we had to date, and then we could raise any issues that we were coming in contact with. So I mentioned that I was concerned with the simplicity of the Lens Studio rig in comparison to the one that I'd previously downloaded. But ultimately, I knew how, regardless of how complex I would have liked this filter to be originally, I was going to have to use Lens Studio's rig despite its simplicity. I also wanted to create a sort of proof of concept for my filter where it would just overlay a skeleton onto the person's face as a sort of makeup filter. I didn't end up finalising this, but it did help me kind of fully decide the aesthetic that I wanted to go for, and it definitely helped me garner a further understanding of Lens Studio. So, after this presentation, I then followed through with the idea of making my own quote-unquote skeleton base in Blender to apply to the rig that Lens Studio uses, now that I understood how the body tracking filter works better. So I created this mock-up skeleton that you can see, that lined up with the different body parts Lens Studio has laid out with the different spines, arms, legs, hips and head. This obviously doesn't match the proportions of a human, but it would have lined up and followed the human body in the rig. So when I brought this into Lens Studio, I struggled a bit with exactly how to make it work the way I needed, but I eventually learned that lining it up so it followed both the proportions and the pose, and manually connecting the hierarchy so each block followed its respective body part worked perfectly. So now I had a plain skeleton that you can see that follows the human body on the screen, so I just had to refine it now to look the way I wanted and make it look like an X-ray skeleton. Unfortunately, outside of college, I had a few setbacks that held me back from working on this for a while, so I had to scrap some of the original idea of making the different layers and adding any kind of educational aspect that I would have liked to add if I had more time. But when I got back into working on it, I went back to Blender to refine my skeleton. I found that this would honestly have taken a lot longer than the time I had, and since I already had downloaded a skeleton asset, I went back to trying to apply that. I wasn't very comfortable in Blender before this project, so it was a bit difficult at first. But eventually I learned how to separate out the different bones easily, so I could put them into different sections that matched up with the Lens Studio rig and then implement that into the Lens Studio tracking filter. I did this pretty quickly. I changing the skull to be more simplified and editing the textures and material to be closer to the X-ray aesthetic that I envisioned. So I just had to bring it into Lens Studio, redo what I did with my own Blender model, and assign the body parts to match the Lens Studio hierarchy and assign it to follow the proportions and the pose. For some reason, this stopped the model from appearing on the Lens Studio preview, unlike with the original model that you can see up here. This was right at the end of my time for working on the project, so unfortunately I wasn't able to properly find out the cause of this problem as I hadn't properly anticipated it. But as you can see, the rig up here worked perfectly. Unfortunately, with the asset that I had used here, it didn't work the same way. In conclusion, I definitely learned a lot more about Blender and especially Lens Studio and the usage of rigs and modelling and filters. Rigging is an extremely finicky and difficult process, but I think I did a decent job in learning it with the different softwares and the time I had, despite the missteps and mishaps outside of college and with the project itself. If I could have done this project over, I definitely would have tried to manage my time a bit better and would have set more realistic goals with myself from the beginning in regards to the final product. But ultimately, I'm quite happy with what I got done and with everything that I learned. So yeah, thank you for listening.